Hello everyone. So this week we are going to talk about a very fascinating character. I think that's how we will end up calling him. Amongst the pre-Socratic philosophers, which is Empedocles of Acragas. Acragas is in Sicily. It is the Roman Argigentum, and I think it's still called something like that, Argigento or something. Right, anyway, so he's from Sicily, so Sicilian. The other person who went to Sicily, if you remember, was Xenophanes, and you'll see the influence of Xenophanes on him as well. His dates, so he flourished, we would say, around 450 BC. We don't know exactly, sort of, as usual, the dates. So we know from Aristotle, and then quoted by Aristotle quoted by Simplicius and Diogenes Laertius, that he probably sort of was younger than Anaxagoras, whom we'll cover next, but he flourished earlier, so he started his philosophical activity younger in that sense. So he lived, they said, up to the age of 60. So we have the dates as approximately from 492 to 432 BC. He was, in that sense, a contemporary of Socrates, in fact, as well. I mean, older than Socrates, of course. Of the playwrights, the big playwrights, Sophocles and Euripides and Aristophanes, and also of Protagoras, the sophist. So what do we know about his life? So he was this, as I said, fascinating figure, because he was both this kind of a magician healer person, and at that time, healers and magicians were somewhat a mixed group, let's say, because sometimes healing did seem like magic, which it does even now sometimes. So a healer, magician, and very sort of this personality in which he goes around saying things like, "Oh, the people of Acragas, my sort of hometown, think of me as somewhat of a god." So this idea of being a bit godlike. So somewhat like Pythagoras, the shaman healer, but also this guru kind of a fellow. And a natural scientist, so not exactly the mathematician in the sort of Pythagorean style, but more of a natural scientist, as you would see, and politically very active. So probably descended from an aristocratic family, but he's supposed to have sort of promoted political equality, promoted democracy. He apparently also, like Heraclitus, refused an offer of kingship. Well, rather, Heraclitus abdicated kingship. Empedocles refused an offer of kingship, so more like Julius Caesar, maybe. And he... I think he broke the power of something called the 1000, which was some huge sort of oligarchy of some sort in his land. He was influenced by, well, from the earliest pre-Socratics. So you can see the influence of the Milesians, as you would notice, and especially Anaximander, and the influence of Xenophanes and Pythagoras, and Pythagoras very much so. And especially the influence of Parmenides, whose challenge he's trying to answer. So in the last videos, in the videos on Parmenides and Zeno, I said that they were a kind of dynamite in the history of Western philosophy, and this is the first influence that you would see, in which he's trying to answer a challenge of Parmenides, answer the challenge of Parmenides that there's no such thing as motion, that you should use your reason, that senses cannot be trusted, and you'll see how he does that. He influenced the later Pythagoreans, and you can see the influence of Orphic religion and the influence on Orphic religion, so that's also there. So he wrote, well, a lot of things are attributed to him, but two things certainly are attributed to him. So he wrote these two works, which were called later Peripherals, like on nature, which again, as I said, is not a name that he probably gave, but a name given to his works by later authors, probably, maybe Aristotle or maybe even later. So Peripherals, which was a kind of scientific treatise, which he addressed to his favorite pupil, perhaps his lover, this sort of young man called Pausanias. And the other one is called Katharmoi, Purifications, which was a religious treatise on sort of transmigration of the soul. And purification was this idea of, so in the amongst the Greeks, they had this idea of having to do these purifications whenever you or your family or your household, the oikos, people living in your household, do something that is that was considered wrong in the sense of maybe killing someone, or not performing a sacrifice, so there were all kinds of these were purifications that one had to do. So the other religious treatise in that sense that he declaimed to the world, and you see the Pythagorean influence here as well, because again you have the scientific treatise, the Periphusios, which he sort of tells his student, and I think there's an injunction there. He says that keep it sort of secret in your heart. So it's not exactly the Pythagorean vow of silence that we were talking about, but again, this is something that is for the student, it's for the initiated, the scientific sort of treatise. Like with the Pythagoreans, you had the mathematical treatise, which was only for the initiated. And then you have the religious treatise, which is for the world, right? Like with the Pythagoreans, you had the ethical, religious, the akousmata, which were declaimed to the world. So what form did these sort of works have? So I think it's from Diogenes Laertius and then Suda as well. So apparently he wrote about 5,000 lines of verse. So he wrote in verse, which is epic verse as well, so epic meter, which was the one used, for example, in Iliad and Odyssey by Homer, which was the one used famously by Parmenides for a poem which for a treatise which doesn't sound like it should be in verse at all, right? It's a proper logical treatise, but in verse form. Like Xenophanes, the other Sicilian. So he wrote in this verse form, and with him you'd see that unlike Parmenides, it does suit some of the things he says. He's very colorful. The verse is very, very colorful. He claimed to be a healer, as I said. He could heal. There's some story that goes that he kept this young woman or this woman alive for many days after she seemed to be in a coma or something. We don't know whether that story is true in any way, but there are stories about his sort of miraculous healing powers, and which mean that he also claimed to have these miraculous healing powers, and he was claimed to be claimed as a wonder worker, a magician of a sort, right? And so he has this reputation of being a bit of a charlatan in later sort of history of philosophy, and a bit of a mixture of a magician, scientist kind of a thing, which in fact is not too, it's like, it is to be expected. The scientists were, in some ways, even if he had made a few devices or experiments which were a bit ahead of his time, or if he did manage to do some healing, which was ahead of his time, it's not very surprising. Except he did take it to heart and did write about himself as well as arising to the gods. And this idea, arising to the gods, we'll talk about, because it's a sort of a Pythagorean Orphic sort of notion of purification, as we talked about. Right. So he also takes, in that sense, like Heraclitus now, a prophetic tone. He's a prophet. The muses speak through him, and in fact, he in his poem, he like in Heraclitus's poem in the beginning, when he talks about, you guys will not, you guys will not understand what I'm talking about. So with Empedocles as well, you have a similar sort of notion of, Pausanias, he's addressing it to Pausanias, not to sort of the no followers like Heraclitus. So he says, try and understand, and if you understand, you too will ascend, but you're not, it'll be difficult. And he says the common public will not understand. So democrat, yes, but with a bit of an aristocratic tone, like with Heraclitus. And so he did philosophy, he did science, he did magic, he did, he came up with a religious sort of system and treatise, or rather, he extended the religious system and treatise of the Pythagoreans and the Orphics. He, in the verse that he wrote, the hexameter verse that we talked about, he used a lot of similes, metaphors, a lot of poetic imagery, and which is why, you have poetic imagery in Parmenides as well, but, to, like, the fragment 8 that we read, it's like a very sort of dense, logic, text of logic and reasoning, while here it's always very colorful and metaphorical, and it's a very colorful verse. And the way he wrote as well. So as I said, we have evidence that the two poems together, if they were two different separate poems, that is, on nature and purifications, they comprise about 5,000 lines. I think so says Diogenes Laertius. I'll have to check, but I think he's the one who claims this. So 5,000 lines on nature and purifications, and he also wrote, says Diogenes Laertius, a discourse on medicine, which amounts to about 600 lines. And he also sort of is supposed to have written lots of tragedies, but we don't have any evidence of that. Suda claims that he wrote the on nature, Peripherals, on nature of things in this case, in verse, in 2 books, and those 2 books came to about 2,000 lines, so the rest must have been purifications. And the medicine, he says that he wrote in prose, so we don't know. I mean, we don't have evidence of that, but what we have then is about 1/5 of that poem. We still have a lot of fragments, like compared to so many poets that we have read. With Empedocles, we really have like a thick wad of fragments, like a lot of fragments, but that comprises a very sort of small part, apparently, of the total work that he did. And the Peripherals, we assume we have because his student Pausanias, kept it secret till he died, and then later sort of made it public. So he was supposed to have this magical personality. He was a kind of a magician figure, as I said, and he also claimed to be thought of as a god. And so therefore there are all kinds of strange stories about his death. Like, so the most believable one is that he got into trouble with his with his land because of politics, and he died in the Peloponnese later from being exiled, in exile. So that's sort of the most normal sort of story of his death. You have other stories in which he jumped into Mount Etna to prove his immortality. So that's one making fun of him. Then there's one which is not making fun of him, which says that, he disappeared at night, this great light shone and said, Empedocles, come to me. And then he went off into that light. And then after that, his student sort of said that he had been taken away by divine forces or something. So as I said, he had this very, like, there are lots of, like, stories that abound about Empedocles as well. The method that he used was an elaborate sort of interweaving of arguments. So, he went back and forth. He put things in different ways to explain things. There are new contexts, very colorful, very metaphorical. So often enough, you don't know where you should sort of take it literally and where you should understand it as a metaphor for some further thought. So, for example, I'll read out this fragment for you, where he talks about the 4 roots. This one, he says, "Hear first the 4 roots of all things, shining Zeus, life-bringing Hera, Aidoneus, and Nestis, who with her tears waters mortal springs." Now, you could imagine this as being something in the line of a Homeric poem. He's also already writing in hexameter, and then he's, sort of naming Zeus, Hera, Aidoneus, Nestus, and at some point, a repeated fragment, I think it's Hephaestus. So there's this idea of the way of writing, which involves, in this case, mythological figures. And we'll see later when we look at fragment, I think fragment 17, that he's actually talking about, no, not fragment 17, or maybe it is. He's talking about sort of earth, water, fire, air. Right, so he says, well, shining Zeus, people believe shining, so must be fire. Then life-bringing, life-breathing Hera, so must be air. Aidoneus, we guess, is earth, we don't know. Nestus, with her tears, is probably water. Right, so this sort of use of mythological figures to talk about elements, and then we'll see that the reason, I mean, we could have put him in a same group as Hesiod or Homer, but he does go seriously into the scientific aspect of it. And in fact, we have evidence of him conducting something close to a scientific experiment in which he is trying to talk about, the elements of air, the corporeality of air, and he's talking about this water clock from which in which it's put into water, and like how the air sort of remains. Anyway, I'll read that fragment out to you later. So you will get the idea of how he speaks, how he writes, and how we interpret. And so in the next few videos, I'll go into like different elements of his philosophy. First, the more sort of, and we'll focus more on the scientific sort of elements, and then we'll talk about his cosmology, cosmogony, and sort of his biology, really, which is very, very interesting. And then finally, we'll do a very short video on his katharmoi, the Purifications, and we'll see how those may or may not relate to his scientific treatise. So with the amount of fragments we have from Empedocles and the amount of variety we have, there's one track to take, really. That's what happens. So this is one of the different interpretations that we'll discuss in our class. Thank you.